again for joining me here. I want to say thank you to the organizers of DevOps Day Boston. My name is Kanish Sharma. I do things related to product and content marketing at Tidelift. As the title says, I'm here to talk to you about open source software and open source maintainers, more specifically the unpaid open source maintainers and the security threat that we're still just sort of wrapping our minds around. Before I get into my presentation, which is mostly based on a lot of data that we collected as part of our 2024 State of the Open Source Maintainer Survey, at the risk of getting a duh, Kanish, are you really asking that kind of question response? I just want to show a hands of how many of you all consider yourselves to be part of the open source community as users, creators, maintainers. Awesome. Awesome, thank you. All right, so before I get into the data that we've gathered, I want to set a little bit of a context for you all. So I'm going to get into a bit of a quick story. Meet Alice. Alice is responsible for IT systems operations for Oceanic Airlines at Logan International. She is, as you can tell, frustrated, concerned, all kinds of negative emotions, because what's happened is Oceanic Airlines, their check-in system's down. They have 5 flights departing in the next hour or so, and their check-in system's down, and Alice's phone is ringing off the hook, text messages, emails, all kinds of modes of communication happening for Alice. The problem is Alice has a full-time job at BU as a systems admin. She does this work for Oceanic in the evenings, nights, and weekends. Make matters worse, Alice is actually also a coach of her local high school's boys tennis team. So she can't really attend to Oceanic until much later in the day, which is why the expression that Alice has. Now, I know this sounds crazy, right? It's meant to sound crazy and far-fetched, but that's really what's happening today with open source software. If you just sort of step back, right? Like, jokes aside, Oceanic Airlines, I heard a couple giggles, you know, I'm a Lost fan, dating myself a little bit. But, you know, you would not be allowed to operate as an airline flying out of any major international airport with sort of volunteer staff managing your systems, right? But that's really what's happening today with open source software. You know, open source maintainers, they're amazing, but they're also in trouble. A lot of people who have contributed code, who maintain projects, who've created projects, they really started this because they were like, well, I have a need, I'm going to write some software, make it available publicly, and you know, over a period of time, they start seeing sort of growth in users, and that's sort of a nice kick in confidence in the work that you've done. And you feel good about yourself, right? You start seeing hundreds, thousands, and millions of users, and then very quickly, the next thing you know is your inbox as a maintainer, as a creator, is getting flooded with requests for features, most importantly for security-related things, right? Like, so, you know, all these large enterprise organizations who are using your software, they're like, yeah, we love open source, but we're not doing much to really support you, but here, go do X, Y, and Z for me, and and do that when you're not sleeping, right? Or not working. So how did we get here? I just want to take a quick pause and ask ourselves that question. Couple pieces of data. This is not related to the survey, but you know, open source really has gone from a niche, sort of nice to being involved in type of environment to really becoming the sort of the de facto platform for modern applications, right? According to a publicly available survey, 98%, up to 98% of applications today, modern applications, contain some sort of open source software. And to add to that, open source code makes up 70% or more of the average application. So let's contextualize that a little bit. Let's look at sort of 3 different sectors of infrastructure. US interstate highways. Any guesses in the room what the valuation of the US interstate highway system is? $6 billion? One more guess. $1.5 trillion. Okay, you're it's sort of, you know, close. $750 billion. There's a source linked over there. What about the U.S. electrical grid? Someone from up there? 2 trillion. Actually, that's pretty dead on, 2.2 trillion. Or actually 2 trillion, sorry. What about the global open source software sort of usage demand side valuation? Any guesses? I mean, in the core sense of it, yes. But how much value is it bringing to enterprise organizations? I heard a couple numbers. Can you? Almost 6 trillion. 6 trillion? Thank you. So this has been a really difficult sort of valuation to put together, but shout out to our colleagues over at Harvard Business School, Professor Nagel and his team. They undertook this research. I mean, it's a really great read if you haven't read it, but they valued it just shy of $9 trillion. So just pause and take in that scale, right? It's pretty enormous. This is why it's interesting and frightening at the same time. I'm going to say frightening, but I want to take this opportunity to say, look, let's not sort of leave here being afraid of open source software. Let's recognize open source software for as awesome as it is. I'm going to repeat this a couple times, but this is frightening, right? Much of the open source software running our companies, our governments, our weapons systems, our airports, our electrical grids, right? Someone up there said the entire global economy, right? It's supported by unpaid maintainers. It's supported by Alice's, right? If you folks in the room are maintainers, unpaid maintainers, tons of respect to you. Thank you for the work you're doing. But let me keep going. Keep that context in mind, $8.8 trillion. Now think about XZ utils. Judging from the reaction in the room, most of you know what happened over here. I'm not going to spend too much time, but this was an enormously devious, sophisticated hack, social engineering hack that was executed, right? This happened over a period of a number of years. In fact, I'll skip forward to the next slide. This is a conversation that happened between someone who uses XZ utils, who pretended to use XZ utils at least, but really was, in our opinion, part of that social engineering hack. This handle, Jigar Kumar, I don't know if that's a real person or not, probably in collusion with Jia Tan, the person who is at the core of this hack, may have sort of executed this. But let's look at what Jigar is communicating to another user. Progress will not happen until there is a new maintainer. The current maintainer lost interest or doesn't care to maintain anymore. It is sad to see for a repo like this. I mean, that's painful for me to read on behalf of Colin, who's the maintainer of XZ. To that, Colin responds, look, I haven't lost interest, but my ability to care has been fairly limited, mostly due to long-term mental health issues. Recently, I've worked a bit with Jia Tan on XZ utils, and perhaps he will have a larger role in the future. Most importantly, though, what Colin also says is, it is important to keep in mind that this is an unpaid hobby project, right? A lot of times, enterprise organizations, they take that for granted. Log4Shell was another such example. I'll actually refer to that in a minute. But look, we are grateful that the engineer at Microsoft discovered the hack, and we didn't really feel too much pain from XZ utils. But I am willing to put money, guarantee the fact that there are other XZ utils out there today. We just don't know of them. We're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. Hopefully never. Hopefully not in a not too much painful of a manner. So, all right, with all that context, if any of you want access to the State of the Open Source Maintainer report, scan the QR code. It'll take you straight to the landing page. But this is a lot of the data that we collected that I'm going to go over next. Just for context, we had about 400 open source maintainers respond. We've done this now. This is the third year that we've done this. This is purely as a source for public knowledge to get better with open source software. All right, show of hands. What percentage of maintainers do you all think are not getting paid? Let's start with 15%. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes.
When you say not getting paid, for example, at a previous job, I had to create something for my job.
Yep.
which was basically hooked up into somebody.
Yep.
Is that considered being getting paid?
If you bear with me, I'll get to that definition, but in this instance, yes, let's consider that getting paid. So how many of you think, let me read the question again. What percentage of maintainers do you think are not getting paid for their work? 15%. All right, good. 30%. Couple hands. 45%. Couple more. 60%. 75%. All right, good. The truth is it's not as dire, but it's 60%. 60% of maintainers responded by saying that they are not paid for the work they do. The breakdown, and sir, to your question, 44% identified themselves as being unpaid maintainers but wanting to get paid. Another 16% said we are hobbyists and we really don't care to get paid. 24% identified themselves to be semi-professional, earning some income from their maintenance work. And then 12% said, I'm a professional maintainer and earn most of my income from project maintenance work.
We're all students.
Look, we can only slice and dice the data so many ways, but I want to have more context for your question, so let me get to that in a moment. We also asked, hey, tell us what do you not like about being an open source maintainer? Lots of responses. The blue bars over here are the latest 2024 data. I want to focus in on a couple specific areas. Not being financially compensated enough or at all is the number one thing that open source maintainers don't like about the work they have to do. Feeling underappreciated or like the work is thankless. That comes in at number 2. Adds to my personal stress. Being asked to comply with requirements I do not have the time for. And look at what's next. It's users are too demanding and expect too much of my time. That's basically what happened with XZ utils, right? That was the thread of conversation that I highlighted a couple slides ago. So what's the impact of all of this? We asked maintainers, hey, tell us, have you considered quitting or have you actually quit? And 60% of maintainers, and this has stayed pretty consistent. Actually, 60% of maintainers from the very first slide say they're not being paid. That has stayed consistent year over year for the last 3 years. And in this case, 60% of maintainers telling us that they have either quit or are considering quitting. This also has stayed consistent year over year. Now, ask yourselves, as enterprise developers, if you all any of you play that role, are you all prepared for 60% of the open source software that you all rely on? And this is generalizing a little bit, but 60% of the open source software that you all rely on goes unmaintained in the next, let's say, 3 months. Are you prepared to sort of undertake all the actions that you need to sort of migrate away from those packages? Is that something you should be doing? What's the cost of re-architecting? What's the cost of other applications that you're developing? It's kind of scary. Okay, so I want to highlight this article that came out in 2016. My story about Alice was actually inspired by this article. It's by the Ford Foundation, and the report is called Roads and Bridges. Pardon me, I'm going to read from the slide. Bad form, but the title is Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure. Like I said, this came out about 8 years ago. The author uses this metaphor of public infrastructure such as roads, bridges, airports, electrical grids, to make the case that our open source code infrastructure is just as important and must be invested in the same way that these other public good infrastructure projects are being invested in. The author is really sort of intended this to be a warning, and the paragraph over here that I'd like to read. Let's take a quick read at it. Free publicly available source code is the infrastructure on which all of digital society relies. It is vital to the functioning of governments, private companies, and individual lives. However, few realize that public code is built and maintained almost exclusively by unpaid volunteers, And the enormous amount of work required is in desperate need of institutional support. Without effective support for coders' work on publicly available projects, not only will their labor go uncompensated, but the digital world risks security breaches, interruptions in service, and slowed innovation. This was in 2016. Ask ourselves, how much progress have we made? A little bit, but not enough. Your giggles are throwing me off. But look, we all agree, right? Like that's a painful laugh, right? Like for me too, you know. Look, this is just a warning sign for us. But let's keep moving on. If you're sitting here and thinking, all right, Kanish, thanks for starting my day in doom and gloom. That's really not my intention here. I'm just bringing facts to you. But look, we can all ask ourselves, how can we help? What can we do as a 10-person group of people building software, or an IBM, as you said, Sanjita? What can we do, right? Simple answer to that is pay the maintainers. This is our logo. This is what we were founded on as a company. Go back, figure out your open source usage. If you can, figure out who the maintainers are behind those projects and pay them. It's easier said than done. Let me answer a couple of questions on how Tidelift is sort of playing a role over there. So over here, what I'm showing you is we ask maintainers, hey, tell us who is paying you. This is not a how much are you being paid. This is just tell us who is paying you, a binary, yes, I'm being paid, and by X, Y, or Z, right? So again, apologies. This is an important slide, so I'm going to read off my notes a little bit. So, the headline here is that the primary source for income for maintainers are donation programs, about 25%, salary and wages from employers, because open source maintenance is an explicit part of their job, so sort of related to what you were saying, sir. And then Tidelift, again, which is the company we work for, we contractually partner with maintainers and ask them to commit to certain long-term practices so their projects are reliable for our customers. So those are the top three, right? A few important things to mention, though, and this I want to read. So none of these income sources are reported by more than a quarter of the maintainers. Again, I'll say that once more. None of these income sources are reported by more than a quarter of the maintainers. So what that means is majority of the maintainers aren't getting paid. Majority of the maintainers are uncompensated volunteers, such as Colin from XZ, right? Also, if you were under the impression that you don't have to worry about paying maintainers because someone else is paying maintainers, let me set a couple things straight. It is not companies paying maintainers. 5% of companies, other than sort of employers, right? Employers paying their employees. 5% of maintainers are getting direct payments from companies using their open source packages or projects. Open source foundations, only 3% of maintainers report getting income from open source foundations. And the government comes in at a mere 1%. Look, if you think back to that Roads and Bridges article, the government has to play a more critical role over here. Open source is powering our electrical grid. Open source is powering our transportational infrastructure. The government has identified open source software as an area of need that they need to invest in. However, painfully slow movement that's happened thus far. There were a couple initiatives that happened last year, the NIST Secure Software Development Framework. There's an opportunity to extend that to open source software. Hopefully, we'll get there in phase 2. The Cyber Resilience Act in the European Union, that goes a little bit further than what we are doing here in the US, but still a massive need for investment in open source from the federal, state government sources. We also know maintainers have told us that they prefer consistent, predictable, recurring income. Let's think about what happened with Log4Shell for a moment. Log4Shell happened. The maintainers behind Log4Shell were sort of inundated with requests and queries and such. good faith enterprise organizations recognize what they're asking of these maintainers, and they sort of made donations, one-time payments, whatever it might have been, to say, hey, thank you for your work. We appreciate you working, or right before the holidays, whatever it is, over the weekend, spending your nights working on the remediation over here. But that was a one-time investment or a one-time payment. What happens next? So great, Log4Shell has, we've published the patch, you've updated your software, and you go about your daily business until the next such vulnerability happens, right? We are sort of, maintainers go back to sort of fending for themselves between the two major events that happen, and really are not able to sort of plan and execute the work that they should be doing in order to avoid the next time, the next vulnerability instance. So maintainers have told us that they prefer predictable income. I also want to just shout out Gary Gregory. Gary is a co-maintainer of Apache Commons and of Log4j. He's a partnered maintainer of Tidelift. And this is a really helpful quote. Gary says, I think the recurring income piece is critical for me. Just imagine what it's like to have a job with a recurring income. Makes you feel safe, secure, and confident that you can keep on doing this work and that it's not time wasted. It also lets you plan ahead. Gary's also self-identified not as not being employed by a large enterprise, but as a full-time professional maintainer, just from maintaining all the different projects that he maintains. All right, so enough doom and gloom, right? Let's all reimagine open source for a moment. Imagine a world where enterprise organizations are able to use open source software the way they please, with all the kinds of guarantees and assurances that they would have from the own code that their developers are building, having the confidence to use it in a long-term manner. And on the flip side, open source maintainers, creators, contributors, getting compensated, getting recognized for the value that they're bringing to the table, and getting compensated for that. And what's more is that we now have evidence that shows that open source maintainers who are paid are able to do more, because various reasons. Oftentimes they're able to bring on more maintainers to help with work, and I want to show you evidence of that. So over here, the highlight is, I don't expect you to read every single line. I'll direct you to the report for that. But the highlight over here is paid maintainers can implement on average 55% more critical security and maintenance practices than unpaid maintainers. That's pretty staggering. And that's also a massive shout out to the work that maintainers are doing, right? I'll draw a couple examples for you. Show of hands, if you are, as developers, are required to make sure there's code peer review happening before you publish your code. 2 hands. But yeah, so that's a common practice, right? So according to our findings, only 27% of unpaid maintainers are able to do that. Why? Probably because they are solo maintainers. Most maintainers are solo maintainers. On the flip side, 53%, almost twice as many maintainers that are paid, are able to implement code peer review practices. Again, oftentimes because they're able to bring on additional maintainers and compensate those maintainers for their time. Another example, did it go ahead? Yes, another example, disclosure plan on how the maintainer should be contacted in the instance of a security issue. Unpaid maintainers have a security disclosure plan documented. About 43% of them said they have that, versus paid maintainers, who are almost 2/3 of them, have a security disclosure plan documented. All right, couple more examples of actual value coming from when maintainers are getting paid. A lot of good happens when maintainers are getting paid. So I want to shout out, any show of hands, any familiarity with Jackson Databind? It's a Java package, massively, I think it's downloaded between 2 and 3 million times a month. So, relied upon heavily. Tattoo, and I apologize to Tattoo every single time. Saloranta, I butcher his last name, but Tattoo Saloranta is the maintainer behind Jackson Databind. Tattoo started receiving income from Tidelift because more and more of our customers started using Jackson Data Bind. So our business model is more of our customers use a package, the more the maintainer gets paid. So Tattoo noticed that Jackson Data Bind was being impacted by remote code execution vulnerabilities. If you want to sort of eliminate that vulnerability, you basically have to re-architect Jackson Data Bind out, and that's a lot of time and effort. So Tattoo instead invested his own time and effort, because he was getting paid by Tidelift and because he was getting paid in general, to re-architect Jackson Data Bind and eliminate the RCE vulnerabilities. So that made it possible for our customers to not have to worry about re-architecting, and God knows how long that would have taken. Another awesome story is Jordan Harban. Jordan is a super maintainer. Jordan has close relationships with several other maintainers in the community. Jordan was using this package called Minimist, and this is a PyPI package. PyPI came out with the requirement that maintainers of their most used packages needed to implement 2FA, sometime last year, I believe it was. The maintainer at the time did not have a phone, so wasn't able to implement 2FA. And that was sort of the last straw that broke the maintainer's back. And the maintainer was like, screw this, I'm done. I'm deleting all my files related to Minimist. I'm out of here. That's when Jordan stepped in. Jordan was like, hey, look, I'm using Minimist heavily. I know a lot of other people who use my packages then rely on Minimist transitively. So let me take over maintenance responsibilities. And Tattoo stepped in and he obviously started earning even more money from Tidelift because he took over maintenance of Minimist. I'm going to go through quickly, last couple of slides. I got the 5-minute warning. Look, again, I said this earlier. My message over here is not doom and gloom. Stop using open source. I mean, it's impossible to stop using open source given where we are today. But let's ask, how do we get better? How do we go further, right? I would urge you all to go back, when you go back to your day jobs, ask your colleagues, ask your peers questions such as, do we have a list of all the open source we're using today? You probably do. Most organizations implement SBOMs. Do we know how many packages we're using have been declared abandoned or deprecated or end-of-lifed? How many maintainers of the packages that we use are getting paid or not paid or are unpaid volunteers? And most importantly, what is our plan if 60% of our open source software usage becomes unmaintained? What do we do in that instance? Last thing, for inspiration, I want to shout out this blog post written by our co-founder, Luis Villa, Paying Maintainers the How-To. Luis does a phenomenal job of summing up everything that's awesome about open source, all the areas of opportunity we have about open source. But I wanted to call out this one last quote. Luis says, no maintainer started their project because of the love of ensuring it complies with your company's definition of enterprise secure software development practices for no pay for the rest of their lives. I think that resonates for all of us. I'll say thank you with that. I really appreciate your time, your engagement. I don't think do I have any time for questions? I'm not quite sure.
We're about at time.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's give a warm round of applause.